This is Marcus Reed. Before we begin, subscribe, like and share, because today I'll tell you a story that proves the coldest betrayal isn't done by enemies in the shadows, but by the ones who once called you brother. Elias Montenegro never imagined that love could turn into an icy blade, driven by someone he embraced every night. At 34, a devoted father and seemingly happy husband, he lived in a house that, in everyone's eyes, was the picture of the perfect family. His son, Miguel, just 5 years old, was his reason for being. Every morning Elias woke early just to make the child's coffee, comb his hair, and take him to the garden while telling him stories. His wife, Helena Vasquez, was seen as the serene mother and exemplary wife, always delicate, always balanced, always with a soft smile that convinced the world of her purity. But what no one knew is that behind that smile lay a woman who silently despised her husband, harboring a cold, calculated hatred that grew as she realized that despite all her efforts, she had never truly won the love of the man she married. Elias loved her, but he didn't idolize her. He loved his son more, and for Helena, that was unforgivable. The accident happened on a rainy Saturday afternoon when Elias had briefly gone out to buy the child's flu medicine. When he returned, he found his son unconscious on the living room floor, his head bloodied near the corner of the table. Helena was crying desperately, but something in her eyes didn't match the desperation her voice was trying to simulate. The hospital confirmed the worst. Miguel died of a head injury. Elias broke down inside, but he didn't have time to grieve. Hours later, the police knocked on his door. The evidence was presented impeccably. Doctored images of alleged abuse, a bottle of sedatives found in his car, and forged messages suggesting unstable behavior. Helena, her face bathed in fake tears, declared that she had been the victim of psychological abuse for years, and that she feared Elias might hurt her son. In less than a week, he went from loving father to child murderer in the eyes of society. In court, Elias wasn't just being tried for a crime he didn't commit. He was being destroyed as a human being. As he was led away in handcuffs, the cameras awaited him like ravenous beasts, ready to devour any shred of dignity he had left. Headlines called him the monster father, his own son's murderer, the silent psychopath. Meanwhile, Helena appeared draped in black, with a dull gaze and the posture of a broken widow, winning public pity with her choked voice and trembling hands. During her testimony, her every word was a death sentence against Elias. She claimed he suffered from fits of rage, that he was angered by the child's crying, that he had once said, "If he doesn't shut up, I will." All lies, all part of something much bigger than impulsive revenge. It was an entire plan, built over months, perhaps years. His defense tried to question Helena's emotional veracity, but the courts didn't want evidence. They wanted blood, and innocent blood. When the sentence was read, 20 years in prison for intentional homicide and emotional cruelty, Elias didn't scream, didn't cry, didn't beg. He just looked at Helena, not with hatred, but with an emptiness so profound that it made her for the first time look away. In prison, Elias understood that he hadn't just been betrayed. He had been erased from existence. The world now believed he was a child murderer, and this made him the most vulnerable target among the inmates. He was beaten in the first days, isolated for security reasons. They shouted his name in the hallways, called him a monster, spat upon as he passed. Elias spent sleepless nights, clutching the thin sheet, repeating his son's name in a whisper that sounded more like the lament of a man buried alive. The grief he couldn't live outside forced him to die inside, and in this inner death, the first inkling of what he would become was born. Someone who wouldn't forgive, but also wouldn't lift a knife. Someone who would return every tear with silence. As the months passed, Elias stopped trying to defend himself verbally. Every word he said was used against him by the other inmates. Soon, he learned to speak only when absolutely necessary. He learned to walk with his gaze lowered, without showing fear, but also without provoking hostility. Silence became his armor, isolation his routine. And it was in this forced silence that he began to reorganize the pieces of reality in his mind. Every memory of the day of the accident was revisited like a crime scene. Every gesture Helena made in the final months of their marriage, every look, every vague phrase of dissatisfaction, every cold smile, everything began to take on new meaning. She had never loved him. She had never loved her son. She loved what others thought of her. Perfection was her obsession. And Elias, being a present and beloved father, eclipsed her social brilliance. When he finally understood that his downfall had not been an impulsive act, but a detailed plan, something inside him stopped bleeding. The pain became structure. 2 years later, still incarcerated, Elias received unexpected news. A prison nurse named Lucio, who had been discreetly monitoring his calm and strange behavior, began observing him beyond the surface. Lucio was one of the few who didn't fully believe the public version. He had analyzed the medical details in his son's report and noticed inconsistencies. The angle of the wound didn't indicate deliberate assault, but rather an accidental fall. There were traces of something in the child's blood, a mild, calming substance that could cause dizziness. This substance had been prescribed to Helena for postpartum anxiety, but never to Elias. Discreetly, Lucio began his own silent search for lost or hidden evidence. Meanwhile, Elias remained trapped within himself, but now something in him was awakened, like a starving man waiting patiently at the door of a cell that might be beginning to open. It wasn't freedom yet, but it was the first crack in the wall of injustice. While Elias faced his demons behind bars, Helena enjoyed her new life as the martyr mother. She became a regular on TV shows and lectures about invisible domestic violence. Her public image grew with each carefully calculated tear she shed on camera. She always dressed in neutral colors, spoke in a low, measured voice, and maintained a look of eternal pain. Pain that the public mistook for trauma, but which, in truth, was just part of a role she had carefully crafted for herself. She received honors, invitations to participate in government campaigns, even offers to write a book. But behind her success lay unrest. Sometimes, when she stared in the mirror for too long, she felt something she tried to ignore, a presence, a shadow. Elias's empty gaze still haunted her, not as a threat, but as a mirror of the guilt she swore she didn't possess. Still, she stifled this discomfort with more interviews and applause. Inside the prison, a kind of legend began to emerge around Elias. His cold demeanor, the way he never begged for anything, and his refusal to react even to the most severe attacks, created an almost frightening aura about him. Some inmates said he had gone so mad he no longer felt pain. Others claimed he was talking to himself with someone no one could see. The truth was simpler and darker. Elias had accepted that his old life was over, and now he simply watched, waiting. Lucio, the nurse, continued discreetly gathering fragments of information. Helena's doctor's orders, medication records, conversations between hospital staff on the day of the tragedy. The case, previously considered closed, now seemed to have too many doors locked too quickly. Elias, realizing that Lucio wasn't treating him like a monster, began to regard him with a different kind of attention, not hopeful, but someone who recognizes a man searching for the truth, even if it doesn't bring his life back. In one of the few conversations permitted in the ward, Lucio finally broke his silence. He told Elias that there were too many inconsistencies in Miguel's death report, and that he had discreetly requested the reopening of access to evidence that had been archived too quickly. Elias remained motionless, staring at the wall for a few seconds, as if processing each word before allowing himself to react. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, controlled, almost neutral. "If you do this, do it right, because if they took everything from me, I won't accept just my freedom." Lucio didn't fully understand the meaning of that sentence, but something about it made him shiver. Elias didn't want to just leave. He wanted the truth to become a sentence, not a judicial one, but an emotional one, something that would destroy Helena the same way she had destroyed him from the inside out. The further Lucio delved, the more cracks he found. He discovered that Helena had researched childhood trauma and domestic falls days before the accident. He also found messages exchanged with a lawyer even before Miguel's death, in which she questioned custody proceedings and rights in cases of accidental death caused by abusive parents. It was as if she had already rehearsed the entire script in advance. Lucio began to piece together each piece in silence, but realized he was being watched by people who didn't want this case to resurface. A veiled warning emerged. Files had been lost, conversations had disappeared, and someone had tried to transfer him to another wing. When he told Elias this, he expected to see him in despair, but instead, Elias simply closed his eyes and calmly said, "If they're trying to put it out, it's because there's a fire, and if there's a fire, a spark is enough." It was the first time in years Lucio had seen anything resembling a smile, not of joy, but of someone sensing the beginning of something inevitable. Time passed, but the truth, as Elias predicted, began to breathe again. A new prosecutor, young and known for reopening cases considered sealed for convenience, anonymously received some of the documents Lucio found. She didn't know who had sent it, but she knew a legal farce when she saw one. The prosecutor reviewed the case with technical coolness and realized that the trial had been too quick, too emotional, based more on the narrative of the destroyed mother than on the logic of the facts. The forensic report had ignored critical signals, and the fabrication of Elias's alleged violent behavior was flimsy, almost theatrical. The case began to be silently reviewed. When Elias was summoned for an extraordinary hearing, whispers in the prison spread. They said he would be transferred to another prison, perhaps punished for something greater. Elias, however, knew that the summons carried another odor, the smell of a chance to expose the rot that had condemned him. During the judicial re-evaluation, new evidence from Helena was questioned, and some witnesses contradicted themselves under pressure. Doctored images were detected, medical reports were contested, and Helena's previous behavior was finally investigated. The prosecutor argued for the invalidity of the previous trial. Helena, upon being notified of the reopening of the case, maintained her composed pose in front of the press, but, in private, she began to lose her balance. Her new reputation, built on theatrical public grief, now trembled under the weight of a possible discovery of fraud. Once revered as a symbol of resistance, she was now viewed with a slight questioning, almost imperceptible but growing like cracks in glass. When Elias entered the courtroom, handcuffed, with his gaze lowered and his beard grown, he seemed a different man. But there was something different, something no one could name. It wasn't hatred, it wasn't madness. It was the calm of someone who had waited long enough for the truth to ripen like poison in the soul of the guilty party. When Helena was called to testify again, she realized the atmosphere was no longer as favorable as before. There were suspicious looks, sharper questions, and a coldness in the air that had never existed before. She was no longer seen as an untouchable victim, but as someone under investigation. As she sat before the judges, she tried to maintain her composure, but her slightly trembling voice betrayed that her once absolute confidence was now shattering. Each of the prosecutor's questions was surgical, hitting points that had previously been ignored. Why did you research childhood accidents before the tragedy? Why did you talk to lawyers about custody in the event of your father's death before the incident? How did you know your husband was using sedatives if the medical records indicate a prescription only for you? Her answers were carefully formulated, but the prosecutor delved layer by layer, revealing something cold and calculated. She was no longer a broken mother. She was a woman at the center of a possible deadly fraud. Elias, sitting silently beside the lawyers, watched without moving a muscle. But inside him something slowly warmed. Not joy, not immediate revenge, but confirmation. She was giving in, and the fear that crept into her eyes was the first step toward her emotional ruin. When the prosecutor presented Nurse Lucio's report as a side exhibit, Helena nearly gasped. Lucio, protecting his identity, had been cited only as an investigative medical source. The prosecutor didn't need him publicly. She only needed what he had recorded. From that moment on, her version began to be corroded by doubts, and doubt was the most powerful enemy of a perfect mask. Outside the courtroom, journalists began to question whether perhaps, just perhaps, Helena's perfect narrative hid something darker. For the first time, she left the courtroom without applause, only amid whispers. The court decided to grant a full review of Elias's sentence, and with that, he was transferred to a special unit while awaiting the completion of new forensic examinations. It wasn't freedom, not yet, but he was no longer amid the shouts and punches of the regular ward. Helena, seeing this, felt the ground shift beneath her feet for the first time. She tried to revive her public image, giving emotional interviews in which she claimed to be being re-victimized by a system that insisted on rediscussing her pain. But the public, once easily swayed, now listened cautiously. Small cracks began to appear in her reputation. Comments asking why so much evidence was being re-evaluated, why a supposedly clear case was now under suspicion. Helena tried to appeal to sentimentality, but where there had been applause, now there was an uncomfortable silence. It was as if the world was waiting for something, a confession, a downfall, or an explosion. Meanwhile, Elias, even within the special unit, remained serene. He didn't talk about freedom. He didn't mention revenge. He simply waited. But inside his mind, a plan was beginning to take shape. Not a plan of violence, but of revelation. He didn't want to destroy Helena with his own hands. He wanted the weight of the truth to slowly crush her until she became a prisoner of herself. Lucio continued to provide new information to the prosecutor in a protected manner, including evidence that Helena had sedated Miguel on other occasions to help him sleep longer, facilitating his social routine. This suggested a pattern of risky behavior that could have culminated in the accident. Helena knew the case was becoming too dangerous. She began to lose sleep, having nightmares in which Elias simply stared at her silently as the world around her crumbled. The truth was coming, and she was beginning to realize there was nowhere to run without leaving a trail of guilt. The new forensic examination confirmed that Miguel's head injury was more consistent with an accidental fall caused by a momentary loss of consciousness, likely the effect of a sedative. This detail disproved the theory of a violent attack. Furthermore, the prosecutor was able to recover through forensic means the searches Helena had deleted from her devices. They clearly showed searches like which sedative is hardest to detect and how to prove someone's aggressive behavior without witnesses. The prosecutor didn't directly state that Helena had caused her son's death, but she maintained that Elias had been convicted based on a fabricated version. This was enough to request his immediate release while the case was formally reopened. When the release sentence was handed down, Elias listened in silence. He didn't celebrate. He didn't cry. He just took a deep breath. Outside the prison, as he walked through the gates, he felt the wind touch his skin for the first time, like a living man. But inside him, there was still something dead, something that would only be revived when the truth was fully exposed. Helena watched the news of Elias's release on television. That night, she dropped a glass on the floor when she heard the newscasters mention her possible involvement in a plot. For the first time, her public expression crumbled. She tried to issue an official statement, but the words seemed fragile. The prosecutor requested that she remain under investigation for perjury and possible indirect involvement in her own son's death. She hadn't yet been convicted, but now she was viewed with suspicion. And suspicion is the most lethal seed for someone who had built their image on emotional perfection. Across the city, Elias walked slowly under the cloudy dawn sky. He didn't return home. There was no home left. He didn't look for friends. None remained. He went to a small rented room where he sat for hours in absolute silence. He was free, but true justice was still under construction, and he was willing to watch every stage of its downfall without moving more than his eyes. Elias's freedom was not greeted with applause or welcome, only with suspicious glances from those still unsure which side to believe. Some whispered in the streets, others met his eyes and looked away as if facing a ghost. But this didn't shake him. He no longer lived to be accepted, but so that the truth would inevitably become suffocating for those those who buried her alive. Meanwhile, Helena began to lose public space. Some events began cancelling her appearances out of an abundance of caution. Contracts were frozen, invitations evaporated. People who had once embraced her with tears now offered brief smiles and suspicious questions. The security of her public image was crumbling. At home, she lived in constant vigil, fearing Elias would come after her, but he never did. And this silence was far worse than any overt threat. She didn't know when, how, or if she would be confronted. She only knew something was coming, and the fear of the unknown began to erode her sleep, her calm, and her face in the mirror. Elias, on the other hand, sought work far from everything that reminded him of his old life. He found work in a small auto repair shop in a remote neighborhood where no one recognized him. The owner, an elderly man named Arturo, didn't ask unnecessary questions. He simply said, "Every man has secrets. I just hope you're more interested in fixing than destroying." Elias responded with a simple nod and immersed himself in manual labor, finding it a way to keep his mind sharp. But every day after work, he discreetly checked the progress of the case. He knew the prosecutor was trying to turn the reopening into a formal charge of perjury. He also knew the public pressure on Helena was mounting, and he waited. He didn't want to expose everything all at once. He wanted her to break down inside, slowly, because he knew she couldn't bear to fall slowly. She was someone built by her image, and people like that don't crumble with noise. They shatter in silence. Helena's nights became a minefield. The silence of the house, once a symbol of peace, now seemed to whisper Elias's name like an invisible echo. She dreamed repeatedly of Miguel falling, but in the dream, it wasn't her son who hit his head, it was her. She woke sweating, panting, looking around, convinced Elias was there, standing in the doorway, just watching, but there was no one. She began taking tranquilizers, the same ones that had once been prescribed to her and used as part of the farce. Cruel irony. Now, the same substances that helped destroy Elias were the only things she believed could keep her going. Yet, even with medication, her body trembled. Her hand couldn't hold the coffee cup without trembling, and her eyes began to carry the empty look she'd once seen in Elias in court. It was as if, little by little, she was occupying the place he'd been forced to live. Meanwhile, Elias followed his routine with almost military discipline. He worked during the day and at night wrote short notes. They weren't confessions nor outbursts. They were cold observations about how the truth was naturally unfolding. He noted every new development in the case, every article that questioned Helena's integrity, every public figure who said, "Maybe we misjudged." He didn't actively seek revenge. He didn't try to attack her. He didn't speak to the press. He simply waited for the revelation to unfold. The prosecutor, strengthened by new evidence, officially moved Helena to trial for extremely serious perjury and possible negligence in Miguel's death. Although there were no formal homicide charges yet, the mere fact that her name was associated with this possibility caused her image to plummet. Helena tried to hire the best lawyers, but even they hesitated to represent her, not for fear of the law, but for fear of public association. She was alone and, for the first time, completely unarmed. On social media, Helena went from warrior mother to possible fraud. Comments poured in like sharp blades. What if it was all a setup? How could a mother who lost her son continue to give interviews months later, perfectly made up? No one who suffers so much manages their grief so well. Her former followers, once moved by every shaky statement, now reviewed her videos suspiciously, looking for signs of acting, and they found them. Small, too contained smiles, tears that only appeared when the cameras rolled, dramatic pauses too perfect. Her image, which had once been her shield, now became her most cruel accusation. Invitations were permanently cancelled. Companies asked her to leave immediately. People crossed the street to avoid greeting her. Some gave her looks of disapproval, others of revulsion. But worst of all was the look of the few who still believed in her, a look of growing doubt that pierced her soul. Helena no longer knew who to trust, or if she could trust herself. Elias watched everything in silence. He never gave interviews, never appeared appeared to confront her. He watched her fall like someone watching a predictable storm, not with pleasure, but with an almost philosophical stillness. One day Arturo, the owner of the workshop, asked, "If she falls, are you going to push her, or are you going to let her fall on her own?" Elias replied without taking his eyes off the metal piece he was repairing. "It's already falling apart. Touching it now would be taking on some of the blame. I prefer to watch from afar." Over time, the prosecutor began demanding that Helena regularly attend deposition sessions where she was confronted with her own recovered files. Each time she left the courtroom, her expression was that of a woman who had aged years in a few hours. At one point, Elias was asked if he wanted to sue her directly for defamation and destruction of life. He remained silent for several seconds and then simply said, "Not yet." Helena's emotional deterioration finally became apparent to all. During one of her mandatory court appearances, she had a mild outburst in the hallway after overhearing two journalists commenting that perhaps the father was never guilty. She tried to confront them, saying that no one understood a mother's pain, but her voice sounded more hysterical than pained. Cameras captured this moment, and the video quickly circulated on social media, this time accompanied by cruel comments like, "This isn't pain, it's the desperation of someone being exposed," or "When the mask falls, the performance doesn't hold up." Over time, Helena began attending psychiatric clinics to try to remain emotionally functional. The worst part, however, wasn't the public judgment, but the silent judgment inside her head. In her dreams, she heard Miguel ask, "Mommy, why did you let him be arrested for something he didn't do?" When she woke, her chest burned as if her breath were being forcibly squeezed out of her. She no longer had the strength to maintain her composure. Her mind had become a prison more painful than any cell Elias had ever occupied. Elias received the news that Helena had been temporarily hospitalized for emotional instability. He felt a strange mixture of silence and finality in his soul. Not joy, not euphoric revenge, just the realization that the cycle was coming to an end. The prosecutor contacted him again, informing him that there were legal grounds to prosecute her for perjury, destruction of evidence, and irreparable moral damages. She asked if he wanted to move forward with the case. Elias didn't respond immediately. He spent a few days reflecting on the bank of a river near his new home, thinking about Miguel, not about his death, but about the mornings when the boy held his hand with absolute trust. One silent dawn, he finally understood. He didn't want to destroy Helena with a new sentence. She was already destroyed, living in the chaos of her own guilt, watched by a world that now saw her as a fraud. And he made his decision. He would let legal justice take its course, without pressure, without rushing, but he would never attack her directly, because he knew that living forever as one's own enemy was a longer punishment than any prison sentence. Helena left the psychiatric hospital a few months later, but she never returned to being the controlled woman who once deluded the entire world. Her public career was destroyed, her social image irreparable. She now lived in a small rented house, far from the spotlight, not just out of shame, but out of fear of the gaze of others. The former media allies who had once profited from her tears now avoided speaking her name. She tried to rebuild a routine, but it was like walking on shaky ground. Any comment, any lingering glance at the grocery store, any child running in the street made her tremble. When she saw parents hugging their children, she felt a tightness in her chest so deep she had to lean against a wall to keep from falling. Sometimes she would turn on the television late at night and find old videos of herself talking about overcoming and faith. She would watch in silence, staring at her own image with contempt and horror. That woman who had lied to the world was now her greatest torment. Elias, for his part, sought neither glory nor reconciliation with society. He didn't want to prove anything to anyone. He simply wanted to live, without the shadow of a guilt that had never belonged to him. He kept the few documents from the judicial review in a box he rarely opened. The prosecutor continued to prosecute Helena, but without her emotional involvement, the case took a purely legal turn. Over time, people grew accustomed to the idea that he had been a victim and moved on with their lives. Elias continued working with Arturo, who never asked for an explanation. One day, sitting at the end of his shift, Arturo handed him a hot tea and simply said, "Some pain doesn't kill, it just changes the way we breathe." Elias sipped in silence, and for the first time, his breathing didn't seem so heavy. He knew he would never forget Miguel, but now he was learning to remember without bleeding. He didn't want eternal revenge. He simply wanted to move on, letting the weight of the truth continue to crush Helena, while he finally learned to live lightly. As the months passed, Helena became an almost invisible presence in the city where she lived. She no longer received invitations, nor glances of admiration, only whispers of revulsion and pity. She saw psychologists and psychiatrists, but her guilt was a broken mirror, each shard reflecting a distorted part of her lies. Sometimes she walked to the old house where she had lived with Elias and Miguel, now occupied by another family. She always stood across the street, watching the light from the windows with a vacant stare. One night, a child from the new family leaned out the window, hair disheveled, and laughed loudly. The sound struck Helena like a silent sentence. She didn't cry. She just felt her soul shrink, as if being dragged back to that day, to that room, to the moment she chose to destroy a man rather than face her guilt. It was too late to go back, and still too soon to die. The worst kind of punishment, living without forgiveness. Elias, on the other hand, found a quiet kind of peace. He never sought another love, but he learned to reach out to people without fear of being shattered again. He volunteered at a local children's shelter, not to replace Miguel, but to offer others what he could never give his own son after his death: protection, affection, and presence. The children didn't know his story, and he didn't bother to tell it. He just smiled when one of them held his hand trustingly. Silently, Elias spoke to Miguel within himself. "I am still your father, and I still know how to love." In these small connections, he found redemption, not the redemption of justice or revenge, but the redemption of existence. He realized that his struggle was never to destroy Helena, but to survive the destruction she caused. And survival, he understood, was the deepest form of victory. Years later, Helena still lived in silence, like someone who breathes but doesn't live. Society had almost forgotten her name, but she couldn't forget herself. She frequented a small square where mothers played with their children, and she would sit on a distant bench, watching. Sometimes someone would look at her strangely, sensing something too dull in her expression. She avoided human contact, not for fear of judgment, but for fear of hearing what she already knew: that the world had moved on, but she remained trapped on the day everything fell apart. When the wind blew hard, she would close her eyes and imagine Miguel running through the trees. But the memory always came distorted, followed by an emptiness that consumed her. Chest. The pain was no longer scandalous. It was silent, continuous, eternal. She wasn't condemned to an iron prison, but she would never escape the prison of her conscience. Elias, for his part, lived simply, far from the headlines and the rage that might one day have consumed him. Sometimes she would visit Miguel's grave, now clean, with fresh flowers, as if to not let him disappear into the lie. He would stand there in silence for long minutes, but no longer wept. He simply took a deep breath, as if to say, "We are free." Not free from longing, but from the injustice that tried to steal even his memory as a father. One afternoon, as he left the cemetery, he found the sky cloudy, similar to the day it all began. But this time, the weight didn't crush him. It simply reminded him that life could be endured even after it was destroyed. As he walked back, Elias understood that the victory wasn't in having punished her, but in having let her face that which no court can absolve, herself. And of that, He never needed to say a word. This was Marcus Reed. And sometimes the harshest justice isn't delivered by revenge, but by watching someone fall under the weight of their own betrayal.